Well, this is the early history of Quakers in Leominster. I must confess that I knew almost nothing about the history of Quakers in Leominster until a few months ago. I got interested then in also relating what was happening nationally to Quakers and others in England at the time. Quakerism was fairly well established in the northwest of England before the early preachers came south. Thomas Parish seems to have been the first. He spoke at the Meeting of Independence in 1655 at the house of Colonel John Jones of Trippleton, near Lentoldine by the River Team, with a message, "Keep to the Lord's watch." The Independents believed in freedom of worship, in contrast to both the Presbyterians and the Episcopalians, both of whom wanted a state church, which everyone had to belong. Parish may have been one of the soldiers discharged by a monk in 1657, in which case Colonel Jones may also have been in the New Model Army, and they got to know one another then, as was a very egalitarian body, as well as a hotbed of political and religious ideas. Parish's talk affected many of those present. In 1656, a year later, 4 of the valiant 60 were sent from the north to the area of Herefordshire by George Fox to preach his everlasting gospel. These 4 were Thomas Goodare, a yeoman, Thomas Killam, a gentleman, and Turner Parker, a husbandman and a soldier, or he may have been in the New Model Army as well, and John Scaife, a day labourer. Scaife and Parker held a meeting at Henry Bedford's, to which a large crowd came. However, they were stopped by the bailiff and John Toombs, the incumbent minister, and taken away to prison. They attempted to hold a discussion with Toombs, but he was unwilling. Alexander Parker was arrested and imprisoned for a few days on another occasion. It seems they weren't arrested, went in prison for very long, those occasions. Fox came to Leominster twice, with 10 years in between. He came in 1657 with Thomas Taylor from Radnorshire, where he'd had a very successful time, near the Pales actually. He describes his Leominster meeting in detail in his journal. He spoke of the light of Christ, which lighteth every man, quoting John 1:4. John Toombs disputed this, saying it was a natural light, and there was a long argument, with Fox quoting freely from the Bible. Toombs became discomfited and left. Next day Thomas Taylor went to see him, overcame him by the power of the word, according to Fox. Thomas Taylor was an Oxford graduate, and seems to have been less adversarial than Fox. There was a contrast between the way the early preachers were treated. Some people flocked to hear them, probably relieved at their positive interpretation of the Bible and the Christian message. On the whole, these seemed to the middling sort of people: yeomen, traders, husbandmen, farmers and artisans. On the other hand, the authorities were fearful that law and order would be challenged, and the ministers of the churches were jealous of their popularity. The mobbing and ill-treatment of them by some of the general population may have been due to fear and hostility, as they were strangers with northern accents, and also rumours that they were witches. Quakers suffered greatly all over the country, both in the 50s, but especially in the 60s after the Restoration. This was when the Peace Testimony was written, and it was in fact a letter to Charles II to explain that they weren't involved in any kind of fighting, whether it for the king or against him. However, this didn't seem to mitigate their suffering. They were sued for tithes, which they refused to pay, for preaching, for holding meetings, for disrespect, as they refused to remove their hats in front of the authorities, and under the Blasphemy Act, as they spoke of the Christ within. In Leominster they were often attacked physically, knocked down, hit with sticks, put in the stocks, and also sent to prison in Leominster or Hereford. One actually died in prison. Goods were taken away in lieu of tithes, sometimes much more than the actual tithe. There are several pages of descriptions of their sufferings in Hereford Records Office, which Wendy Bartlett kindly sent me. She's actually here at this conference. Amidst all this persecution, Fox realised that a structure needed to be set up to keep the whole group together. and he travelled the country, setting up monthly, quarterly and yearly meetings according to his belief in gospel order. He came to Herefordshire in 1667, 10 years after his first visit, and writes that they had several blessed meetings, setting up a monthly meeting for Leominster and Ross and others in the south. Meetings of worship in Leominster were held in private houses at first, some in the town, others in the surrounding villages. First burials took place in private gardens, but land was bought for a burial ground in 1660 by friends from neighbouring villages, which is this present site. They did not build until much later. Memorial stones were not introduced until 1850, and was just a mound over the grave. The first meeting house was built in 1687, just before the Toleration Act, which was quite sensible, as before then meeting houses were sometimes attacked and destroyed, as the Hereford one was. There were two buildings. A separate one was built for the women's business meeting. I've got a picture of it on display. The women's house had a chimney. It had a fireplace with a chimney. It was separated by a yard from the men's, but they met together for worship, but they had separate business meetings, because the women dealt more with overseers' matters and pastoral care. A total of 5 meeting houses were functioning in Herefordshire in the late 17th century, in Amley, Bromyard, Hereford, Ross and Leominster, of which only Amley, Ross and Hereford remain. In the 18th and 19th century, Leominster was a centre for nonconformists, Presbyterians, Moravians, Baptists, Seventh-day Adventists, Plymouth Brethren and Llewellynites, who were a small group who didn't last very long. They all built places of worship. The Quakers were the first to build. The original meeting house collapsed. It was built on the old town ditch, so a new one was built in 1834, which was a Georgian building of brick and slate with tall sash windows. There was a covered passage to an altered women's meeting room. The plans are available for display on the side. In 1869, the old buildings were removed, leaving only the 1834 room, which a matching extension was built for the women's meeting, with a partition with sash shutters. It occupied the whole width of the site and included a door opening onto the burial ground. There were cloakrooms and a new lobby along the South Street side. There were plans for display as well. The map of 1825 marks the Quaker Meeting House. Quakers in the 18th century were rather quiet. The leaders had mostly died. Many had emigrated to America, and they kept a low profile. However, in the 19th century, Quakers were keen to evangelize, and mission halls were built in some of the neighbouring villages. There was one at Luckton, one at Puddleston, one at Stoke Prior, under the care of Leominster, and one at Woolton, under the care of Amley. Traditional services were held on Sundays, with a preacher from the responsible meeting, and hymns were sung. Quakers were very active in social projects in Leominster, and other speakers will tell you about them. By the turn of the century, the burial ground was full, and land on Newlands Drive was bought in 1904. The old memorial stones were moved up to this site and placed along the sides. The meeting in Leominster was actually discontinued in 1969, and the property sold to the Jehovah's Witnesses in 1978, 9 years later. Attendance must have fallen off quite considerably at that time. It's interesting how Quaker meetings rise and fall. In the 17th century, Quakers were very active. 18th, they were rather quiet. 19th, they were extremely active. 20th, it seems to be rather middling. We haven't really done a great deal, but they do tend to change, because historically the Amley meeting was disused more or less in 1797, but it was revived with help from Leominster. And Ross also had a difficult time, but it's been revived now. At the present time, there are only 3 Quakers resident in Leominster, and 1 shortly to move in. All of us are members of Ludlow Meeting. However, we hold a meeting for worship once a month in Leominster on the last Friday morning in the community centre. Everyone is welcome to come. There are some items for display on the side and a plan of the present burial ground.
I don't know. But it seems quite, again, it is possible that we have to do something significant.